All right. Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for our press conference for taking action to protect students from sexual harassment in experiential learning. My name is Britney De Costa, and I'm the Experiential Learning Project Lead for Possibility Seed's Courage to Act project. To give you a sense of how this session will flow, all of our speakers will deliver their remarks, and then we'll have time to receive some questions. I ask that you please use the raise hand function at the appropriate time to deliver your question. Otherwise, please ensure that your mics are muted. If you're having trouble with anything technical or accessibility related during the session, please let Laura Murray know by reaching out to her directly in the chat, and she'll be happy to assist you. Our speakers today are as follows. Aryanna Chartrand, Advisory Committee Member for Possibility Seed's Sexual Harassment in Experiential Learning Research to Action project, and former Chair of the Alliance of BC Students. Aideen Reynolds, Chair of CFS Nova Scotia. Vivian Chiem, President of the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance. Laurence Mallette-Léonard, President of the Fédération, étudiante, collégiale de Québec. And Bishoi Aziz, President of the University of Alberta Graduate Student Association. I'll begin with some remarks about why we're here today, and then pass it along to our speakers to talk about specific policy and legislative recommendations for post-secondary institutions and governments. As I mentioned, my name is Britney De Costa, and my pronouns are she, her, and I'm here today on Between the Lakes Treaty No. 3 territory. I'm the Experiential Learning Project Lead for Possibility Seed's Courage to Act project. Last year, student leaders across the country released the Our Campus, Our Safety Student Leaders Action Plan for institutions and governments to address and prevent sexual violence on campus. The action plan included a call for provincial and territorial governments to address sexual violence in experiential learning opportunities by implementing the legislative and regulatory recommendations collaboratively developed by students, experiential learning professionals, faculty and staff, and sexual violence experts. This call came alongside Possibility Seed's work leading the first study on the issue of sexual harassment in experiential learning in response to gaps in research and a recognized need for support, resources, and tools to address this prevalent but often hidden issue. As part of our Sexual Harassment in Experiential Learning Research to Action project, we conducted national surveys, interviews, and focus groups, and held consultations with students, staff, faculty, and administrators at post-secondary institutions across Canada to better understand people's needs and concerns. One identified need was for more robust policy and legislative frameworks to address discrepancies across the country and support a comprehensive approach to addressing sexual harassment against students in experiential learning positions. Existing institutional policy and legislative frameworks that are intended to address sexual harassment at post-secondary institutions or in the workplace often overlook or exclude students who are in experiential learning positions. This creates a gray area where there are clear gaps or a lack of clarity around the responsibilities of institutions and experiential learning providers and what protections against sexual harassment are available to students in the context of experiential learning. This gap is particularly important to address given the prevalence of sexual harassment against students in experiential learning. In fall 2022, Possibility Seeds conducted a national survey of students, staff, and faculty at post-secondary institutions. And 1 in 2 students who responded to our survey shared that they had experienced at least one form of sexual harassment at least once during their experiential learning. There is a lot of work to be done, and today Possibility Seeds released recommendations to inform policy and legislative frameworks to guide this work. We urge post-secondary institutions and provincial and territorial governments to take up these recommendations to protect students from sexual harassment in experiential learning. I'll now pass it along to our speakers to share a few of these recommendations. Our first speaker is from Possibility Seed's Sexual Harassment in Experiential Learning Research to Action Project Advisory Committee, Aryanna.
Thank you so much, Brittany. Good morning, everyone. My name is Aryanna Chartrand. I use she, her pronouns. And I had the opportunity to be a part of the advisory committee for this work for the last few years. So the broader recommendation here is that we really want to ensure experiential learning contexts are clearly included in the scope of institutional sexual violence policies. And so as part of Possibility Seed's sexual harassment and experiential learning research to action project, we reviewed the sexual violence policies from post-secondary institutions across Canada. And of the policies we reviewed, only 25 of 79 university policies included and explicitly included experiential learning within their scope. And so this isn't nearly enough. There needs to be some sort of standard. When the scope of a sexual violence policy is unclear, it creates ambiguity as to the protections and supports for students in experiential learning contexts. And this really decreases institutional accountability. And right now there's this increased demand for teachers, nurses, early childhood educators, and so many other essential workers across the country. And these jobs require students to engage in experiential learning. And it is incredibly irresponsible not to have this language and the policies in place addressing the sexualized violence that is happening in these spaces. It really shouldn't matter either where a student decides to go. They do have a right to trauma-informed and survivor-centered care. And so the students being involved in these policy decisions in institutional accountability is really what's needed to ensure that this collective commitment to take sexual violence seriously that is so prevalent in post-secondary spaces, but especially in experiential learning contexts. So we recommend that institutional sexual violence policies explicitly include experiential learning contexts in their scope. And so I'll pass it on to Aideen for our next recommendation.
Hi folks, I'm Aideen. I'm the chair for CFSNS, Canadian Federation of Students Nova Scotia. I'm joining from unceded, unsurrendered Mi'kma'ki. I am here to speak to the recommendation to provide legislative and regulatory guidance to post-secondary institutions on addressing and preventing sexual harassment or violence. So one of the things that provincial and territorial governments can do is support PSIs with recommendations to provide legislative or regulatory guidance around the scope of sexualized violence policies. It's clear that there's an existing gap in all 7 provinces with sexualized violence legislation or regulatory frameworks. This would align with the calls in the Our Campus, Our Safety Student Leaders Action Plan for institutions, governments to address and prevent sexual violence on campus. Student leaders across the country called on provincial and territorial governments to strengthen sexual violence prevention legislation by introducing provisions and guidance for institutions to develop mandatory sexual violence policies with students and community input across all provinces of drafting and reviewing the policy that meets a set of minimum standards. The regulatory gray areas here effectively allow both experiential learning, like advisors and supervisors, and the institutions to shirk responsibility for the sexualized violence in these experiential learning environments, and further endangers the students who are meant to be learning in them. We recommend that the explicit inclusion of experiential learning context within the scope of institutional policies be one minimum standard for sexual violence policies that governments provide provisions for. These calls are not made without knowledge of other institutional violences students face and are not to be used to increase policing on campus. The evidence indicates that not only increased policing doesn't protect students from these violences, but further endangers them. But the lack of inclusion of experiential learning environments in university sexualized violence policies or governmental legislation means that our students are at increased risk within their learning environments. These experiential learning placements are critical for so many students, including like medicine, law, education, and science students. And these legislative policy oversights act as a barrier to the students achieving their degrees safely. And I am to pass it to Vivian.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name is Vivian Chiem, and I am the Ontario Undergraduate Student Alliance President. I am joining from the traditional territory of the Neutral Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. One of the most commonly identified needs in Possibility Seeds Sexual Harassment and Experiential Learning Research to Action Project was for post-secondary institutions to have clear procedures in responding to a disclosure of a student being affected by sexual harassment and/or violence in an experiential learning environment. Students also expressed concern that staff and faculty efforts to ensure their safety were undermined by a lack of institutional frameworks, and shared how this gap was a factor in their decision to not report the sexual harassment and/or violence they were subjected to. We recommend that post-secondary institutions develop a protocol that lays out the specific procedures to be followed when a student has been affected by sexual harassment and/or violence in experiential learning contexts. Similar to other policy recommendations related to disclosure processes, these institutional protocols should embody the principles of survivor-centric and trauma-informed approaches to ensure students are treated with the utmost care, support, trust, and comfort. By establishing a comprehensive protocol that addresses the unique challenges faced by students in experiential learning, post-secondary institutions can foster a safer and more inclusive environment for all students pursuing their academic and career goals. Such a protocol would contribute to a culture of trust and safety where students are empowered to come forward and report incidents of sexual harassment and/or violence without fear or judgment. Experiential learning opportunities are a powerful learning tool for students to enrich their post-secondary education, and post-secondary institutions have a critical role in facilitating positive relationships between employers and students. Developing a specific protocol would send a strong message that the institution is committed to safeguarding the well-being and rights of all students in every aspect of their academic experience. Thank you once again, and now I'll pass it on to Laurence.
Hi, I'm Laurence Mallette-Léonard, President of the Fédération étudiante collégiale du Québec. I will now continue in French. Donc, à l'heure actuelle, il demeure d'une importance capitale de mettre en place ou de renforcer les mesures ainsi que les lois provinciales et territoriales visant à protéger la population étudiante face au harcèlement et aux violences à caractère sexuel en contexte de stage. En effet, dans plusieurs provinces et territoires, le cadre législatif actuel visant à prévenir les VAX n'adresse pas explicitement les cas des personnes étudiantes stagiaires, rendant celles-ci particulièrement vulnérables. Ainsi, la FEC s'unit à Possibility Seeds afin d'inviter les autres provinces et territoires à suivre la voie pavée par le Québec, en passant par la voie législative pour assurer la protection de la population étudiante lors d'activités de stage ou de laboratoire. Donc, plus concrètement, en 2022, le gouvernement du Québec a adopté le projet de loi 14. La loi visant à assurer la protection des stagiaires en milieu de travail. Il s'agit d'une première loi provinciale ayant comme objectif unique de protéger les personnes étudiantes en milieu de stage en venant établir les différents recours possibles pour les personnes stagiaires victimes de harcèlement ou de violences à caractère sexuel. Il est également important de noter que le Québec se démarque par rapport aux autres provinces quant à la proportion de politiques incluant les milieux de stage en prévention des violences à caractère sexuel. En effet, 66,7% des politiques institutionnelles visant la prévention des VAX d'établissements d'enseignement supérieur québécois protègent également la population étudiante en milieu de stage, alors que c'est le cas dans seulement 21,3% des universités ailleurs au Canada. Bien que le Québec agisse à titre de précurseur en matière de prévention du harcèlement et des violences à caractère sexuel en contexte de stage et de laboratoire, beaucoup de travail reste à faire, autant au Québec que dans le reste du Canada. Même si la prévention des violences à caractère sexuel doit avant tout passer par un changement de culture, les gouvernements provinciaux et territoriaux se doivent d'agir afin de conscientiser et de responsabiliser les milieux de stage quant à la vulnérabilité des personnes stagiaires. I will now je vais donner la parole à Bishoi.
Thank you, Laurence. So, hello, everybody. My name is Bishoi Aziz. I'm the University of Alberta Graduate Students Association president. So last year, Albertan students achieved a huge gain with collaboration between the provincial government and the post-secondary institutions to have a standalone sexual and gender-based violence policy, separate from the General Code of Student Conduct. At the U of A, for example, the university community, including the students, developed such a robust policy rooted in trauma-informed principles. This development marks a pivotal milestone in the evolution of post-secondary institutions' approach to tackling sexual and gender-based violence. This, of course, in addition to legislative protections against workplace harassment and/or violence available in Alberta and also in all the provinces and territories. However, this is just one step on the road. There is still a notable gap in safeguarding students undertaking experiential learning opportunities. While students in these opportunities are technically protected under the work harassment legislations, the extreme power differential leaves students in a precarious position. The fear of jeopardizing their academic degrees and future careers silences many students who might otherwise speak out. The situation is even more pronounced for students coming from marginalized groups, including women, LGBTQ2S individuals, Indigenous people, people of color, and international students. And I believe that this deficiency in research contributes to the lack of awareness of the problem. So it's imperative for provincial and territorial government to grasp the unique circumstances faced by students in experiential learning settings. In addressing this concern, it's recommended that the following amendments to be made to workplace harassment and violence legislation at the provincial and territorial levels. First, to integrate explicit provisions within provincial and territorial workplace harassment and violence legislation to encompass students participating in experiential learning, regardless of whether they are engaged in compensated or unpaid roles. Second, to enhance provincial and territorial workplace harassment and violence legislation to foster accountability and facilitate the collection of data pertaining to the incidents of sexual harassment and violence within workplaces. Concurrently, the role of post-secondary institutions remains pivotal. These institutions are urged to undertake comprehensive investigations into the extent of sexual harassment endured by students during experiential learning opportunities. Such research endeavors hold the potential to shed light on the issue and provide pragmatic solutions for its mitigation. Thank you, and I'll pass it back to Britney.
Thank you, Bishoi, and thank you, Aryanna, Aideen, Vivian, and Laurence as well. We want to thank you all for tuning in, and we have some time for questions now. So if you can please use the raise hand function, and I'll call on you, and we can answer some of those questions for you. Yeah, Tricia.
Sorry, it took me a second there to unmute. First of all, I just wanted to say thank you so much for this fantastic presentation, and it's very illuminating. The question that I had related to the intersectionality of the recommendations, as the folks mentioned that folks from certain marginalized backgrounds may experience an intensification because of the power differential. And I was just wondering if there are specific recommendations that or ways in which to include in some of the policies how you might account for some of these intersecting areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your question. Maybe I can get us started with some thoughts there. So yes, that's a really huge and important piece of the work that needs to happen, is recognizing who's most impacted by sexual harassment, who's most vulnerable, who experiences increased barriers to reporting, to accessing supports. One example Bishoi mentioned was international students. And I think when it comes to policy and legislative amendments, particular attention needs to be paid to international students at the legislative level, making sure that the workplace violence protections are available for students. One of the concerns is where students are unpaid. A lot of sexual violence legislation or workplace harassment legislation does not apply, depending on what province you are in. And for students who are here on a work visa or a study visa or a work permit of some kind, this can be extra tricky whether the legislation applies. So making sure that it's inclusive of all students in this way. Same as at the policy level, making sure that our policies are written through inclusive and intersectional applications, and making sure that we're attentive to some of those unique needs. So part of that is making sure that these changes are being done in consultation with students, in consultation with those most impacted, and are attentive to the different sort of vulnerabilities in legislation and status that are at play. I don't know if anyone else would like to jump in there.
Sure, I can add a couple comments to that. I really think that question just emphasizes the importance of having students involved throughout the entire process of these legislative changes and recommendations. I come from like an ECE, early childhood education background, lots of education. It's a predominantly female and women of color dominated field. And so there's already a lot of existing gender equity in these roles. And so just recognizing that it's going to be those voices and those students who are identifying that this is impacting people disproportionately really need to be the ones sitting down, having the conversations, and then being a huge part of making these recommendations. Otherwise, these gaps just really don't get identified.
If I may, so in Nova Scotia, universities are governed by a memorandum of understanding between the university's, collective body and the government. That is what has mandated province-wide sexualized violence prevention, like standalone policy. And what I'll say is like, those policies are so different at each university. I represent 6 universities in Nova Scotia, and I'm lucky to have attended a school where students fought really hard to be included in these consultation processes, and a really significant portion of our policy at my university was actually written by students, but that's not the case at the majority of the universities that I represent. And I want to echo the sentiment of like, if we're not willing to include students in our in the drafting of these policies and the creation of these spaces, then who are they for, really, right?
I just wanted to say a quick thank you to everyone who responded. Thank you so much. This is very helpful.
Thank you for your question. We have time for another question if anyone has one. Maybe I'll give it about 15 seconds for folks to raise their hand if you'd like. All right, well, we really want to thank you all for being here today. If you do have questions that come up for you, oh, yes, Laura, pass it over to you.
Hi there, sorry, I just see a question in the chat.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thank you, Daly, for your question. Sorry, I missed that in the chat. The question in the chat is, did your research highlight any specific strategies for working with placements, getting them on board? And maybe I can speak a little bit to that. We're working on a final report right now that we'll share some further recommendations for practice, in addition to the policy and legislative recommendations that are out today, and also all of our findings from the research. And this was actually one of the biggest challenges that was identified. When it came to strategies, I think that's an area that we need a lot more work in when it comes to getting placements and experiential learning providers on board. But across the board, what we heard was that there is a need for sort of buy-in from experiential learning providers, and making sure that they understand that they have a very important role to play in making sure that their workplaces and any experiential learning setting is safe for students. And one of the things that was really interesting we did a national survey of experiential learning providers, and one of the common themes that came up was that they were very committed to this issue now that they had heard more that this was an issue. So I think we heard a lot of, wow, I didn't realize this was such a prevalent issue. I didn't realize this was happening as much as it is. I'm going to return to my organization and we're going to work on updating our policies, or we're going to talk about training. So from what we did there, one of the things that comes up is just an awareness really that this is such a prevalent issue. And I think there will be that'll be a way to get folks on board in one way, but there is still challenges in getting those folks who are a little more resistant on board. And I think that's where continued work on this issue is really needed. Would anyone else like to jump in there?
Yeah, thank you for saying that, Brittany. I also think this shows an opportunity for post-secondary institutions as well to really have some accountability before they're making connections and relationships with experiential learning providers. It really does stand to the university. If this place is not safe, we will not work with them. I think there's a big opportunity there for the institutions to play a really big role in protecting their students and vetting thoroughly and having a really high standard for the partnerships and collaborations that they have.
Thank you, Aryanna. I think I don't see any more in the chat, but please jump in if I'm missing anyone. But we would like to thank you all so much for being here today. If you have questions later on, you can feel free to reach out to Aryanna Snow. Her email is Aryanna@possibilityseeds.ca. And you can download the full set of policy and legislative recommendations on the Courage to Act Knowledge Center by clicking on the link that Laura provided in the chat. Thank you again for being here today, and take good care. Bye for now.